introduce someone who doesn't need any introduction, I think, to this audience. I'm also honored, yesterday I was even more honored to give him the honor of an honorary doctorate. So keep in mind, he only obtained a PhD yesterday, but I'm sure that he's also, as always, young of mind, as well as experienced in his overview of meta-research. So thanks. John, please.
Thank you, Jelte. What a great day. I really enjoyed being in several of the parallel sessions. I'm sorry that I left halfway in some of them, but I had promised to be in several. Lots of interesting ideas, lots of things to consider and brainstorm and follow up with several people. So I will try to share some thoughts on meta-research in different scientific fields. As Jelte said, I just had my PhD yesterday. So indeed, in my first years as a trained or trainee researcher, my mentor and department chair used to say, focus, focus, focus. I mean, he realized that it was completely scattered. This is what most of us are really trained to do. To try to focus in one area, actually one sub-area, one sub-discipline, sub-subdiscipline, sub-niche, and really make a career there. So that arrow in a map of recent science is my best paper, which is a speck of dust and a speck of dust and a speck of dust, somewhere around there. And most of the time we don't see the rest of the galaxies that exist in the universe of science. But science is a very dynamic universe. Currently, its published footprint, the visible matter, is about 160 million papers and scientific books. We don't know the exact size of the dark matter, but probably it is much larger if you think about how many data points and data sets are accumulated, many of those at the borderland of whether they're research or science. There's about 500,000 disciplines out there that use the scientific method in one way or another. And even though all of them use the scientific method, there are differences on how exactly they do that. So there's differences in the degree of determinism that one can hope to have, physical sciences versus social science, for example, signal to measurement error ratio, complexity of designs and measurement tools, closeness of fit between hypothesis and experimental design and data, how much statistics have been introduced into the field, what are the analytical methods to test hypotheses, whether people even test hypotheses to start with, what is the typical heterogeneity that people can tolerate or actually would be ashamed not to see in the results? Is heterogeneity a good thing or a bad thing in the field? Many fields have grown literatures of moderators, for example, as the key way that they publish papers. Others see heterogeneity as a sign of bias. Whether there's a culture of replication, there's fields that want to replicate everything because they understand that if they don't do that, they will just be publishing junk and noise. Others see replication as me too, to be avoided, a second-rate type of effort. Whether there's transparency or not, whether people want to accumulate knowledge or see single studies one at a time. What are the criteria for claiming truth, whatever that might be? Are there thresholds being used? How stringent are these thresholds? How closely are they followed by the community? And finally, why do people do that research? Do they want to learn about the world, some abstract kind of truth? Do they want to save lives? Do they want to make money? Or combinations of all that? And what are the consequences of getting it right or getting it wrong? So there's a lot of variability across fields, and some of that variability is justified. Other sources of variability are completely non-justified. They're just incidental, opportunistic. They just arose out of the phylogeny of these disciplines as they evolved. But there are some common themes, and what I like about meta-research, which is obviously my own bias in liking meta-research, is that one can ask standardized questions that can apply to very different fields. So questions like, how do we perform research? How do we communicate research? How do we verify research? How do we evaluate research? How do we reward the best research? All of them can be applied, of course, with different transformations across almost any field. And obviously, in each field, there will be different aspects of these questions that would be more relevant, more hot, more exciting, more interesting to take to the next step. There are many related disciplines to meta-research, and many of those have tried to ask similar questions. Many of those have grown in specific disciplines or have focused more in specific disciplines. I'm listing just a few of them here. Others are more generic. So history and philosophy of science is pretty generic. What differentiates it from meta-research is that it's probably less empirical. Or one can see that maybe meta-research is like an empirical epistemology type of branching of philosophy of science. Psychology and sociology of science, statistics, data science, informatics, evidence-based medicine, or as Joe Lau would say, evidence-based X in general. Research synthesis methods, meta-analysis. There's a vast world of methods on meta-analysis. David Moher's journalology, the science of studying journals and publication systems, scientometrics, bibliometrics, organizational operations research, ethics research, research integrity, accountability research, communication sciences, public policy, behavioral economics. All of those disciplines, in a way, can lend methods, can lend technologies, can lend tools to meta-research evaluations. And even though most of them have a tradition of being applied more to some fields rather than others, I see no reason why they cannot be extended and applied in other fields as well. I will give you some stereotypes here. Many fields share these stereotypes in that they do this type of work, and therefore they are likely to have the same challenges and the same problems. One stereotype is the recipe of doing research with small data, with small sample sizes, with small studies. Typically, you see that this is done with solo siloed investigators in small teams behind closed doors or in a closed computer that others cannot see. It doesn't have to be a BL3 type of lab that you need to wear special wear to be able to enter to handle HIV or Ebola. Most research is handled like Ebola. No one else can enter that lab to see what's going on there. So you need to have a lot of trust, and there's lots of disincentive of opening the door and spreading that virus to the community. It needs to be kept within the lab. Within the lab, that lab needs to survive, so it needs to cherry pick the best looking results to publish them. A lot of that is done post hoc. P-values of slightly less than 0.05, many of them induced with p-hacking, are enough. There's lenient criteria, and somehow the fields have gravitated to these rules because otherwise labs would not be able to survive. If you ask these small sample teams to go for p-values of 10 to the minus 20, that would take a lot of p-hacking, really, to get there. And most time it would be just naturally impossible. No registration, no data sharing, no replication. This is one stereotype that I think is very common, and you can see it across very different fields. Here's a few examples. It's the dominant time of paradigm across very different stages of research in neuroscience, along with Catherine Bouton and Marcus Munafo. A number of years ago, we looked at evidence in different stages of neuroscience, from basic science, preclinical, clinical trials. The common denominator was very low power to detect what might be meaningful effect sizes. Typically, power was in the range of 20%, even with relatively lenient assumptions. And again, other empirical evaluations. Here's one that we ran with Dennis Sukes from Cambridge, looking at neuroscience, psychology, and medical related research. We saw the same pattern. Power was, on average, not really different. Even if you go to very remote fields in the in the universe of science, galaxies that are light years apart, like observational economics. Along with Tom Stanley and Christokouliagos, we looked at every single meta-analysis that we could find on observational economics topics, 130 topics, 10,000 studies, 70,000 effect estimates. Very similar profile to neuroscience. So observational economics and neuroscience have the same stereotype, probably more or less, even though they're so far apart in the universe of scientific investigation. Another stereotype that is becoming fairly common in several disciplines now that data has become more massive is the big data paradigm. Here we have the opposite scenario. We have very large sample sizes, and this means that studies are overpowered to detect anything, no matter how trivial it is. So this means that you have an embarrassment of riches. If you go to an electronic health record, the problem is not to find a significant result. You don't need to p-hack anything. Everything is going to be statistically significant. But you still need to come up with a narrative. You still need to focus on something. You need to say that here's something that stands out. So again, there's a lot of cherry picking. Many of these databases by default have been accumulated in ways that post hoc investigation is the only way to go. They are there. They're not under your control. They're growing while you're sleeping. They're adding observations from different hospitals and admission systems while you're not even noticing, but next day the database is going to be bigger. People are struggling with statistical methods to analyze these evolving massive sets of information. And I think that there's more statistical sophistication there. More people have given thought, and some of that thought has also transmuted into applications. I think more people are sensitized that, you know, if you just try to use p-values of 0.05, it's not going to really have a lot of discrimination ability here. But most of these tools tend to be idiosyncratic. There's very little communication between fields that may use different statistical tools, even though the types of questions that they ask are pretty similar. Most of that research is also not registered, and because these data do depend to some extent, sometimes, on the extent that they can be shared, and therefore on the extent that they can be tapped and explored and exploited and analyzed, there is probably more data sharing, but unfortunately, not commonly you see that people who use them, they cannot understand what exactly is being shared and what these data really do, and how has this information been compiled, and how trustworthy it can be, how much validity is there in the grains of information that comprise that huge data set. So even though we have more opportunities with big data, we also have more opportunities for bigger noise and for bigger error, and the balance is unclear on whether we can tilt it to our benefit or it's going to be an even more erroneous paradigm. All disciplines are struggling with these issues, and we have shown and seen that all disciplines are interested in having valid results, in having reproducible results. This is some text mining exercise looking across all 22 major fields of science, trying to see how often people use the term reproducibility of results. And you see that there's a geometric increase across all 22 major disciplines of science. So it's not that these evolutions are happening in vacuum. People are sensitized to the need to think about, is what we do valid? This means that there's also a lot of fields that go through soul searching and explicitly try to test what they have thought until now as the standard knowledge in their field. Psychology, which is very well represented in this audience, had that soul searching in the last several years. You're all familiar with the Open Science Collaboration paper in Science that tried to see what would happen if we tried to reproduce papers from our three of our top journals. And this is how the results look like, not very convincing about the validity of the original results. although one might say that maybe the original results were correct and the reproducibility were wrong, or maybe both are correct for various reasons, or maybe both are wrong. But it is some sense of soul-searching that has pervaded the field, and I think that this is what is leading to the investigation of things that in the past would not have been investigated. People who would have taken for granted, this is a paper published in a good journal, I just need to take it at face value and believe it. Even the creme de la creme journals like Nature and Science are subjected to this sort of evaluations of reproducibility. This is the Nature Human Behavior paper published last year, looking at 21 top papers published in Nature and Science. Not really very different compared to what we have seen in other evaluations in social sciences and psychology. Some other fields went through some soul-searching even earlier on. So genetics had a long history of publishing tens of thousands of papers until the mid-2000s, and very quickly, all of us working in genetics could realize that most of what was being published could not really be replicated. When someone tried to look at the same gene variant in a new sample, the signal was not there. And the field decided to really change everything that they were doing. Instead of using very lenient statistical rules, they decided to use very stringent statistical rules, taking into account the full multiplicity of the universe of polymorphisms that they were exploring. They decided to join forces. Instead of having small teams create large consortia, replication became a sine qua non. No major journal in genetics would publish something unless it had been replicated in multiple teams with consistent results. When that transformation happened, we could go back and see what was the credibility of the literature that was published in the very best journals over 20 years. We're talking about 40,000 papers. And this is a sample of such evaluations showing a replication rate of 1.2%. I think that that's not uncommon. I think that there's several fields out there that probably would have a replication rate of 1 or 2 or 3%, but have never gone through that transformation for various reasons. Maybe there's a feasibility component. Genetics, for example, had some add-ons that made life easier, like the cost of genotyping went down 100 million-fold, while measurement in other fields is still as expensive or almost as expensive as it used to be. But I think that many fields would benefit from encouraging that soul searching and realizing whether they're a field that is operating at a 1% credibility rate or a 50% credibility rate, or perhaps a 90+% credibility rate. I'm sure that there are such fields out there already. In other cases, the soul searching started not from academia, but actually from the industry. So in the case of preclinical research, it was the industry who started questioning whether the results that we're getting from academic centers, even the very best ones, were such that they could be trusted. And for them, it was not an issue of publishing more papers or getting promoted to professor with tenure. It was an issue of investing $500 million or $1 billion or euros to try to develop a new drug target that had been proposed by some famous team at Harvard or Stanford, but actually this didn't work in their hands. So several companies started running these reproducibility checks on top-cited academic papers, and their success rate was between 0% and 25%. Very low, but not really weird compared to what they already knew for many years, that most of the literature that was coming their way from the very best papers was just not getting anywhere when they tried to make it work for real applications. Something else that has reached interdisciplinary notoriety is the reproducibility wars. I have seen reproducibility wars between originators and replicators, so you can use other names, in many different fields. I have seen that in medicine, with the former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine saying that people who use other people's data or try to do something or check whatever, they're parasites. I have seen that in psychology with technical comments to what I think is the very best paper that psychology ever produced, with famous psychologists claiming that that paper was horrible. I mean, if that paper was horrible, then imagine what the others would have been. I have seen that in practically every scientific field where results are contested. And some of that is probably natural. Some of that is really part of the scientific debate and very welcome. In other cases, I think it's a phenomenon that is interesting to study on its own in order to understand how much freedom do we have to change our opinions, to change our beliefs based on evidence. A number of years ago, back in 2007, along with Athena Tuzioni and Nikos Bonitsis, we had looked at resistance to refutation in the biomedical literature. We took some of the most clearly refuted claims. These are situations where people had made big claims, mostly on observational data, and multiple, very large randomized trials had shown absolutely no effect, no causal effect for these proposed effects based on association evidence. And we tried to ask, well, did people abandon that earlier belief? For example, that beta-carotene could be the solution to cancer, that you eat more carrots and cancer will go away. The observational studies had suggested 50–60% reductions in cancer rate with beta-carotene, while 6 large randomized trials showed absolutely no benefit. We saw that there's tremendous resistance to refutation. For example, in the case of beta-carotene, people continued to cite the observational claims and entirely ignored the randomized trials. And they said it's well known that beta-carotene is effective chemoprevention for cancer. And therefore, we continue doing our research with beta-carotene. And in this paper, we describe you this model of some tumor growing in a tail of a rat and building more evidence about how important beta-carotene is for cancer. In other cases, people did cite the quote-unquote refuting evidence, but they said it's wrong. I still believe the weaker study designs. I think that these large randomized trials are wrong. They should have done things differently, and I don't believe the results. So I'm very interested to see how these reproducibility wars, how these reactions to different results, to heterogeneous results, to refuting results, might evolve in different fields. How likely are different fields to accept that some new evidence is available and that new evidence may be different to what we thought before. Something that has been very successful in many fields, but not in a homogeneous way, is meta-analysis. Meta-analysis was proposed a century ago, but really it started having a dent on medicine just a couple of decades ago, and in other fields as well. In many fields, it's still not used. People don't have a tradition of synthesizing results that are available from multiple studies to see how they look like, how heterogeneous they might be, and whenever it's possible, try to get a synthesis and a common effect that might represent them, plus minus their heterogeneity. However, there's about 100,000 meta-analyses out there already. Some fields represented more heavily than others. And along with Dan Fanelli and Rodrigo Costas, we could exploit the availability of that information to look at up to 300 meta-analyses from each of the 22 major scientific fields across science, trying to understand whether there are patterns compatible with biases. And how do you do that? Well, you have to ask if a particular type of bias were to exist, and I had multiple studies published in that field, how would the results of these studies look if that bias operated? So you have patterns of results, patterns of heterogeneity that are compatible, consistent, or inconsistent with the presence of a particular bias. For example, publication-related biases may express themselves with what we call small study effects, small studies giving, in their published versions, more prominent effect sizes compared to larger studies. Do we have evidence for this type of pattern in different scientific fields? Or do we have a pattern that is suggesting that gray literature is giving different results compared to published formal journal type of literature? Or do we see a decline effect where the early results published in a field are somehow attenuated. There's attrition in the effect size as we perform more studies. Do we see an early extremes proteus phenomenon, where the first study claims a huge effect, and then within a very short time we see an opposite effect? There's a window of opportunity in early refutation. If you can refute something that is very prominent, this is something that the field is likely to enjoy a lot. Citation bias, differential effects in US-based studies versus others, industry bias, industry-sponsored studies giving different results compared to others, and other factors that are not necessarily related to individual studies, but policies, like country policies or assessments of author productivity or author impact, or aspects of mutual control, like is it important to have a small or a large team size, or where is the research done, or is there collaboration? Do you have researchers joining forces who are living in different countries way apart? What is the impact of the career level, of gender differences, or whether there's a track record of some violation in research integrity? What we saw is that most fields, the meta-analysis that we could see, had patterns of results that were compatible with the presence of most of these biases in most fields. However, the magnitude of the biases were different across different disciplines. For example, if you take the first panel on the top left, small study effects, which mean that small studies find larger effect sizes compared to larger studies, it was very prominently seen in the social sciences. It was pretty prominent in the biological sciences. It was not really seen, a very soft signal or trend, in the physical sciences. And one potential explanation might be that physical sciences, when it comes to experimental results nowadays, the standard is that you have 30,000 physicists who join forces and they all share the same mega, peta, tera database from CERN to try to run their analysis, and they cross-check their results. They have teams replicating each other. They need to see all the results. Everyone can tell if someone is trying to sell an unreliable result based on a small study. While this is clearly not the case in the social sciences, and it's rarely the case in biomedical sciences. As you can see, other types of biases or patterns compatible with biases also could be seen in most fields, but again, with different magnitudes of effect. For a long time, I have wondered whether it's possible to have an overarching observatory of research practices across all scientific fields. And here, Tom Hardwick has put together some data on some observatory-style studies that we have performed in biomedicine, covering the period from 2000 to 2014 with a random sample of papers published in any biomedical journal, an updated one from 2015 to 17, psychology 2014-17, and social sciences 2014-17. And as you see, there's some aspects of research practices that are moving, and we see quite a lot happening. For example, open access within the last 10 years seems to have become more common. It's probably more common in psychology and social sciences compared to biomedicine, but we still see quite a number of papers being open access. We see very little in terms of material availability, especially in psychology and social sciences. We see a little bit more in biomedicine. Not much for data sharing, for raw data availability, except for biomedicine in the last few years. Very little or nothing in terms of an analysis plan that has been pre-specified and registered somewhere. Pre-registration, a little bit of action in biomedicine for some particular type designs, like randomized trials, but even then, you have about 50% of randomized trials that are not pre-registered. Protocol availability slightly moving above the zero line in some fields, but not much. And then some other aspects of transparency, like conflicts of interest and declaration of funding, doing better, probably a bit better in biomedicine now compared to in the past, and same applies for funding, but still quite a lot of room for improving transparency in these dimensions as well. This is just scratching the surface of where we stand, but I think it would be nice to have such evaluations done across very different fields. I think that there's pockets within larger fields that may have very different practices in terms of some of these transparency and openness and reproducibility indicators, and maybe try to learn from these fields how they have done it, what was successful in their case. Another type of comparisons that I find interesting is trying to understand how results look like if you compare different disciplines. For example, what are the typical effect sizes that are circulating across different fields? What are the typical correlations that are populating the literature in different disciplines? Or what are the different types of statistically significant or not significant results? What is the proportion of significant results, and what is the proportion of significant results in favor of the documented or declared primary hypotheses in different disciplines? Dan Fanelli had published that paper about 10 years ago looking at support for the primary hypotheses across different fields. He found a pretty steep gradient across sciences. For example, space science tend to have much lower quote-unquote success rates in that regard compared to psychiatry and psychology or pharmacology and clinical medicine. In many fields, we see that almost everything that gets published is statistically significant one way or another. This is a text mining exercise that we did with David Chevalarias from the Institute of Complex Systems in Paris. We found that 96% of the entire biomedical literature, when you look at abstracts or full text, where we could look at about 1 million papers in full text, if they have p-values, these p-values include statistically significant results. There's a slight decrease over time from 98% to 95%. I see that as good news. A little bit more negative results are needed, but still too good to be true overall. And we have seen such trends also in other disciplines unrelated to biomedicine. How many of the solutions that we are discussing are likely to be transplantable across different disciplines? I think this is a major challenge. Now that the meta-research community has grown, there's a lot of interesting ideas and a lot of ideas that have actually been implemented in real life, and we know that they have worked or they have failed in some particular fields. In a way, I believe that there's an opportunity for people to take some of these solutions in their own field and ask, are we willing to test them? Are we willing to apply them? Are we willing to make them the norm? Do they sound like a better way of doing research compared to what we have done already? And I think that the fields that are going through that soul-searching phase are likely to start adopting some of the solutions that other fields adopted. For example, as I mentioned, genetic epidemiology did completely transform itself by adopting team science and collaborative work and full reporting of results. I think that this type of teamwork and large-scale collaboration can be applied to many other fields besides genetics, and these other fields can learn both from the successes, but also some of the collateral damages that have ensued in the field. For example, in many fields in genetics, you feel now that all the results are reproducible, they are replicated, they're very consistent. Statistically speaking, they're very robust, but they're completely useless. And the problem is that people are continuing to invest billions of dollars in probably useless research. I mean, we have documented that it's going to be useless, but all these people are very successful. They're doing great, useless science, and you cannot tell them that they need to switch to something else. Standardization of protocols also is something that different fields can learn from each other. There are some fields that standardize their protocols and they feel that everyone can agree on what is the best solution and the best way to go. In other cases, like in this one that we try to dissect with Rebecca Martin, looking at stem cell research to differentiate stem cells into dopaminergic neurons so that one day I can hope I can gain back my memory and not succumb to cognitive loss or Parkinson's disease. There's 100 protocols, and there's no reason for them to exist out there. There's very little coordination in the field on how exactly this should be done. What have we learned? What are the aspects that are optimizing our chances of success? Registration. There's tremendous variability across fields on whether they're adopting registration and what type of registration. Most fields adopt no registration at all. There's very few fields that have registered what data sets they're playing with. Registration of protocols is happening in some fields like randomized trials. I would argue that it needs to be done more broadly. We have the example of registered reports with 221 journals that have adopted the policy, but actually very few of them use it in a way that you have a volume of papers being produced. You have similar practices to register reports that were adopted by the Lancet about 20 years ago. And they worked for a while. So Lancet was reviewing papers, especially for large randomized trials, based on their intent to run the research and accepting them in principle. At some point, they said, we're not going to do that any longer. I think we can learn from some of the successes and the failures. Registration of analysis plans. As I showed you, very little is registered in terms of analysis plans, and I think that different fields could start doing that and trying to see how much do we learn, how feasible is that, what are the obstacles to try to register analysis plans. Sharing of raw data, I'll show you more information because I think it's pretty crucial. It's at the center of what we trust and why. A few months ago, lots of people, I'm one of the 70 authors, and I was the corresponding author because they said who will be most likely to tolerate all the negative comments. That was the only reason, I think. I participated in this along with great colleagues where we argued that the new way of sharing should be that the primary investigator generating the data should not really have any rights to use them. It should be the community immediately using them rather than waiting for the primary investigator to work on them and generate whatever analysis. Because in many fields, probably in most fields in genomics and omics and big data, the aggregate information of all the data producers and then the aggregate analysis is likely to be far more reliable compared to the little slice that a single investigator can generate in his or her own lab. There's other fields that are more resistant to sharing data. For example, this is our data arc project where we try to ask investigators who had published their most highly cited papers across all literature in psychology and psychiatry to please share the information with metrics, and we would make the information readily available, curated for free. We asked for no money. Some did share their data, and some had already shared their data, but the vast majority could not. But what we learned from that project is that data sharing most of the time is even outside a researcher's control. And I think that this is likely to be true in many fields. The PI, the principal investigator, is not really the principal investigator. It's just like a front page person who puts their name in front because he or she is a famous professor, but maybe the data are controlled by a different entity. For example, the company that has sponsored the research, and maybe they have never seen the data that they're publishing with their name being the corresponding author. If you do change the standards of sharing, probably you can improve dramatically the level of availability of data. PLOS Medicine and BMJ in the last 4 years have asked for routine availability of raw data as a precondition for publication for clinical trials. And when we did the same exercise as the data arc, asking the investigators to share the data with us and telling them that we will analyze the data to see if we get the same results, 46% of them did share the data. And we did reanalyze what we got, and we got very similar conclusions in all of them. We found a few errors, but none of them were earth-shaking such that would invalidate the main conclusion. The whole system is in flux. The whole system of science is in evolution, and I think that meta-research is acting as a machine in a way in driving some of these evolutions. As I showed you earlier, we have seen improvements in several indicators of transparency and openness. Across biomedicine, this is how it looks. If you go from 2000 to 2017, the typical paper in 2000 had no chance of sharing anything. It was less than 1%. In 2017, about a quarter of papers do have some raw data that are being shared. Declarations of funding and conflicts of interest are also becoming more frequent. They're still not perfect, but I think they're better. And there's more people who are willing to say that what I'm doing is replication, and don't feel ashamed about that. Actually, very often they're very proud about running replications and showing whatever they have to show. Some machinery is common across all scientific disciplines. For example, computational methods. They can be applied to social sciences, they can be applied to physical sciences, they can be applied to biomedical sciences. Some consensus on what should be the standards on the transparency of methods and analysis can really go a long way in improving what we do. And I think that this is happening at the same time as seeing many of the computational methods being employed becoming more black boxes, more difficult, less transparent by their very nature. I think that we need to face that complexity and increase transparency for the declaration of how these methods are run, what exactly are they doing, what is their input, and can we make them to work in a different environment. Finally, better statistics. Statistics are also something that are shared across different sciences. And as I mentioned, there's very little transparency in statistics. There's very little training. Most fields have no training of statistics or statistics light training, so we need to improve the literacy and the numeracy of the scientific workforce. Most people are not trained on what are best study designs and what are limitations. They're not trained on standard features. For example, randomization and blinding of investigations in animal experiments are something that is done only 5 to 20% of the time. I'm not sure whether there's an easy solution to that. So it's not just offering people a checklist. Anna showed in her plenary earlier today that if you just offer checklists, you're not likely to do much in peer review. I would argue it's pretty much the same, although it hasn't been studied if you try to just offer checklists to people doing research. We need to train better researchers, and that's not something that can be done overnight. Do we need to agree on our statistical methods? This is an ongoing debate. For example, some of us argued that the methods that we use are horrible and we need to do something. We're drowning by statistical significance. I'm one of the co-authors of this paper which says, let's move statistical significance by 1-0. It's a temporizing measure. You know, we just keep some of the flood coming our way until we can regroup and train and be better prepared. Others say that that's not going to work. And indeed, the tools that we're using, they're not the best fit for most of the research questions that we are asking across science. You know, null hypothesis significance testing is probably the best tool in about 20% of research that can be done. In other cases, other methods might be better. But there's a lot of debate on what do we do and how much do we standardize what we do across fields, and some of that debate is healthy. I would like to see where we go from there. Finally, all of that needs to be aligned with the best and healthy incentives. If we don't use healthy incentives, this is a set of 11 equations that, along with David Grimes, we put together to create a small in silico universe of science. We said that there's 3 types of scientists: diligent, careless, and unethical ones. And we run through funding cycles. If they're successful, they get funded, and they also create progeny of other scientists like themselves. We found that practically the diligent cohort is starting to disappear, and the careless and unethical cohort is taking over. And why is that? Basically, you don't need 11 equations. It's just the fact that if you cut corners, you have to do less work to get there. If you don't cut corners, but you don't do any work to get there, you know, complete fraud, then you will get there faster. So we need to find ways to give credit and give rewards to the best science. We need to reward not just productivity, but quality, reproducibility, sharing, and translational impact. This is unlikely to happen unless there's a movement across multiple fields. When a university needs to decide, it's unlikely that it will decide based on one discipline, that, you know, we will take care of societal impact or sharing of data just in the social sciences. It needs to be done more widely. It needs to be something that there will be a movement across multiple fields, across multiple institutions, across multiple funders. And here's some suggestions that we tried to put together last year. There's another very nice paper on the Hong Kong Declaration that was shown earlier today. To conclude, meta-research is an opportunity. I think that the fact that we're dealing with the core of the scientific method, it means that what we find could be relevant, could be informative across any scientific discipline. Different scientific fields have different standards of practice, and these differences may or may not be justified. I think that in the large majority, they're not justified. It's more like custom that has prevailed. Successful research practices may be possible to transplant from one discipline to many others. Not always, but in many cases there may be some low-hanging fruit that if people know that that exists, they could take care and use it. Finally, interdisciplinary efforts may be best to improve scientific research in large scale, but field-specific grassroots adoption of standards is necessary. Transparency, openness, and sharing are likely to help, but details on how to may be field-dependent, and fields going through soul-searching should probably do some more soul-searching and move in that direction. A million thanks to all of you for being here, and special thanks to a number of members from my team who have tolerated me over many years of meta-research adventures. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Are there any questions? Yes, please. He has trained for this. All day.
Is a comment also allowed?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Deep thoughts as well.
Judith de Schuur, I work as a statistician in Amsterdam. I want to share some optimism about bias. If we think of fading effects in series of studies, I think that could also be an indication of science working properly instead of scientists doing publication bias file drawing in the beginning of that series. Because we can only see it if we have a series available. We can see that the effect sizes fade, and maybe the reason why they fade is because in the beginning scientists were selective about what initial studies to continue studying, and that's a good thing. We don't want them to randomly do studies into new things, but look what has been done before. So maybe what we're seeing in fading effect sizes could be this selection process, choosing what to study next instead of choosing what to file draw. And it could be a good thing.
Yeah, I think that it's the decline effect is multifactorial, and I think that in different fields, different factors may be more influential. Some of them have very strong theoretical support, and you would expect them. For example, you expect to see decline effects in studies in fields where the early studies are stopped early. So in lots of clinical research, we know explicitly that the early studies were stopped early because people saw some effect that they said, we cannot continue, we need to stop the study. The DSMB is telling us to stop the study. It's so huge, we need to rush to publication, whatever. And you know, if you run the math, that if you stop at that point, your effect size is going to be inflated by 22%. So you can exactly pinpoint, although practically none of these papers adjust the presented effect size for that inflation. Some of them may comment that, by the way, we stopped early, so therefore our effect size is likely to be inflated. So there's a component of inflation that is even mathematically anticipated. There's another component that is, let's say, sociologically anticipated. If you know that there is publication pressure and publication bias, you do expect to see this type of decreasing effect. And there may be other situations, as you described, that you see a qualitative change in the type of the question or the setting where the question is being addressed. So in dissecting which is the contribution of each factor, and there's obviously other idiosyncratic factors that may happen, and chance, of course. I think you need to know a little bit about the dynamics of the field. How does it operate? Is there early stopping? Are we talking about mostly small studies? Is it a field that has high registration? Is it a field that evolves its questions versus all the questions are always the same? Like there's many fields that you cannot even modify the question. You just have to run the same question again and see what happens. And then you can decide which is the contribution of each of these features.
Thank you. I have a question. So now we obviously hope to continue to be inspired by your research. So I don't hope you will ever become an administrator of sorts. But it would offer one benefit at the least. So the question relates to that. what if you were to be the king of science in terms of funding?
Oh, no.
And how would you allocate the funds? Maybe it's a too broad question, but still. I'm just curious to know.
Well, to start with, there shouldn't be a king of funding,
No.
because that person would be
If anyone would be doing it, I would trust
that
you.
person would be assassinated within a few days by the possible successor. So, yeah, I think that's not a good idea.
You know your classics well.
I mean, clearly, we have very little evidence about how best to allocate funding, and Anna pointed that out in terms of the systematic reviews that are available. Some studies done in health sciences, allocation of funding through peer review. We don't even know whether peer review is the way to go, because obviously there's many other systems, lottery-based, just based on the person rather than the project, or what is the balance between judging the person or the project. Institution level, public versus non-public. In some of the parallel sessions we discussed with people around me that maybe we should incentivize people to do research with no funding, just go back to that old era where people were just paying their own money to do research and killing themselves while doing the experiment on their own. So, of course, I'm joking for the last example. But I think that we need more research on what is the best funding methods. I think that many of the funding agencies are very recalcitrant to do this research. They feel some obligation not to rock the boat a lot, because they, especially public funders, they say this is taxpayers' money, we cannot really rock the boat too much. But we don't really know what is the best ways of doing funding. And I think it's going to be different if you are talking about different types of research. My bias for biomedical research, and you can probably extrapolate that to other fields, if you separate research into a blue sky phase, where I have no clue what I'm doing and I have no clue what it's going to be used for, maybe nothing, or maybe this is going to be the salvation of humanity that has to move to another galaxy 3,000 years from now, or 30 years from now, unfortunately. That type of research, I think, needs to be done with public funding. And my preference would be to be funding that you give opportunities to lots of smart people to explore ideas uninhibited, just go wild, completely crazy. Don't have too many senior people oversight this and drive the research in what they have already done. Just go for something that's completely new. Second phase, we have found something, and now we want to translate that to a useful application. We have replicated the basic knowledge, and we want to make it into a drug, a device, a car, something that you can take home and make it work. This, I think, should be funded by industry. And again, tell them, do your best, spend your money on this. It's your money. If it doesn't work, you have wasted your money. And phase 3, once you have that drug, device, car, refrigerator, computer, whatever, have public funds available, an independent, completely unconflicted body of researchers who will test these technologies and see whether they really work or not. And they will also know what to prioritize in terms of testing, what to compare against what, and what is best for the societal value. So public, private, public, the way that we do it now is entirely the opposite. So every technology, when it comes to be evaluated, we ask those who sponsor the technology to do the evaluation, which is completely crazy. It's like telling people, are you the best painter in the world? Oh, yes, of course, I am. Are you going to give the prize to yourself? Can I? Yeah, of course. So I think it's opposite than it should be. And I think that some of that mentality could be applied to other fields as well, allowing for peculiarities.
Thank you. I think we are at the end of this fascinating day and this fascinating talk by John and the others. I would like to first applaud John again. And thank him for his great talk. And then I want to, we have something for you as well. And then I need to ask some people, yes, you too, to come to the stage. Where's the rest? Where's Olmo? Where's Hilde? Where's Anton? Where's Esther? And the others who've made this happen today. Most of the work they have done. So big applause to them, please. So, woo. So oftentimes I lose sleep over the problems in science. But then I realize young folks like these and others around here and others around the world, with the energy that they have to dedicate themselves and their careers to improving science, and that gives me energy every day. So thank you all. I hope to welcome you again to Tilburg for whatever reason you want to come visit us in our Tilburg Meta Lab. But also, hopefully, that's the plan at least, in July 2021, when we hope to fill the entire auditorium with even more meta-researchers. Thank you for coming, and may the truth be with you. Thank you. Okay.